Hello, all you beautiful people out there, and welcome to Atheist Church. Today we have a very special guest on. His name is Dr. Josh Bowen of Digital Hammurabi, and he's got way too many credentials for me to remember, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Well, thank you for having me on, Lisa. It's good to be back. It's been a while. So I guess just really quickly, I got my bachelor's in science in religion from Liberty University back when I was in the military, and then I went to grad school, got my master's in theology from Capital Bible Seminary, and specialized in Old Testament. And then, excuse me, I wrote my dissertation there on the divine name El Shaddai. And then got accepted at Johns Hopkins. So went there and got a master's in ancient Near Eastern studies, and then kept on and got a PhD in Assyriology, so study of like ancient Mesopotamia, Sumerian, Akkadian. But I had like a sort of a big minor in Hebrew Bible because of my background in it. So that's my educational background, if that helps.
Nice. And he's also got a few books out. I know you've got a book on slavery out. And what else you got out?
So I always have them here just because people ask. So there's the Old Testament slavery book. And then this is a publication of my dissertation. I wrote it in the dissertation itself is available for free, but I wanted to have something that actually people could read. So this is Learning to Pray in a Dead Language. So it talks about prayer and education and how those things relate in ancient Mesopotamia. And then our most popular book, surprisingly, more surprising to me than anybody else, was this one, Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian, an introduction for complete beginners. That one, it's immensely popular. People really like it. So I just finished my fourth book, and it's called The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1. And I just gave it to Megan to start her second round of editing. I did my editing, and she's going to do hers. And that should be coming out hopefully no later than the summer, maybe a little bit before. So we're excited about that.
Cool. I can't wait to read it. That sounds awesome. You know, with all this stuff I'm reading about Daniel, and I already knew Daniel never existed and all that, but I never knew it was this deep, So anyway, our topic for today is does the Bible condone slavery? And there are actually two different kinds of slavery in the Bible. There's debt slavery and there's chattel slavery. Mm-hmm. Chattel slavery, for my American friends, would also be antebellum slavery. So, Dr. Josh, I know Christians want to deny all the time that chattel slavery was a thing in the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. But how do we know that is not true?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the big thing to do in these discussions is to sort of make sure we understand what it is that we're talking about. So like setting the definitions early on. I think this is actually one of the bigger problems in these debates because the word slavery, I think, gets muddled. The waters get a little muddied. And so what is debt slavery and what is chattel slavery? So debt slavery, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but I just think people need to recognize that debt slavery is any type of slavery that is contingent upon a debt. So essentially, one is deprived of their freedom, and their labor goes to the benefit of the master. If it's debt slavery, that slavery hinges upon the repayment of the debt, that is owed. So once the debt is repaid, then the slavery ends, theoretically. Chattel slavery is not contingent upon a debt. That's the distinction. So
is there a set time for the debt to be repaid before a Hebrew could take a debt slave?
Yeah, so that's all contractual. And again, a lot of this evidence comes from the wider ancient Near East, and contractual law and those sorts of things are certainly not my area of expertise. But if people are interested, I can point you to resources. But essentially, different contracts, just like today, different contracts had different stipulations in them. So somebody could say, I'm going to loan you X amount of grain, and you pay whatever percent interest, and the loan has to be repaid by this date. And if it's not repaid by this date, then you default on the loan. And so whatever that period that got negotiated on the front end is, that's the period that it's negotiated. So all quite often, the person taking the loan in these situations was not necessarily in an advantageous position to be able to negotiate, in their favor. Sometimes, obviously, that happened, but whenever that default came, one of the ways of becoming to paying off that debt is to enter into debt servitude. Now, we see more information on this in the wider ancient Near East. So you can, like, for example, it's pretty clear. You can read through the laws of Hammurabi, and you'll see, for example, if somebody has I always forget which law it is, like law 115 or 114 or something like that. But if a person has taken out a loan of grain or silver or whatever, and owes that to the creditor, can take can essentially take someone from the household in while that payment, once it's defaulted, they can take that until the payment is made as a distrainee, they call it. So there are certain legal restrictions on that. You can't, there are penalties if you kill the distrainee, and it's essentially lex talionis. But those are things that can be done to make good on the debt. The person can go into debt servitude themselves. Once that happens, the problem with debt slavery that the law is trying to mitigate abuse, and in the wider ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible, there's a limit set on debt slavery, the period of time. And the rationale behind that is, if I go into, let's say I owe you $1,000, Lisa, and I go into and I become your slave. Well, now you can justifiably say, well, God, now you're working for me, so you're repaying the original $1,000 debt. But now you're living with me, so that's room, and I'm having to give you food, so that's board. So now there's interest, and now there are additional charges, and if there aren't regulations set in place, now that $1,000, you work for a year and you pay off $200 or something, but you've racked up another $500 in room and board charges, or interest or whatever. So the rationale behind these time limits that you can serve, the 3 years in the laws of Hammurabi, for example, or the 6 years in the Hebrew Bible, is just to cap that and to say, look, if they work for you for 3 years, it's the whole kit and caboodle, right? It takes care of everything. It takes care of your debt. So that's sort of the rationale behind the debt slavery. I feel like I ramble on a bit, so I was getting ready to go into chattel slavery, but I thought maybe we'd want to stop and talk about that.
No,
800 things that I've said.
Fine. No, I love this stuff. But yeah, So let's get into chattel slavery now. Now, if I am correct, most of the time males were not chattel slaves because they were like dead, right?
So it depends on the situation. So the way that the Hebrew, if we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, and again, we have to ask the question: is this really how this was practiced or not? That's a different. I think that's a different topic. But as far as what the text is laying out, um, if the head of a household, or if, um, yeah, let's just a male debt slave gets sold, a male gets sold, an Israelite gets sold. There are laws that are specific to him that don't apply to foreigners, right? And that's a distinction I think a lot of people miss. So there, while people like to tout out the, have one law for the resident and the foreigner, or for the Israelite and the foreigner, it's not that doesn't apply in all circumstances the way that you would like that verse to apply. So in places like Exodus 21:2-6, you see that an Israelite can come in as a debt slave, sell himself as a debt slave, and he serves for 6 years and released in the seventh. So he can become a chattel slave. And again, chattel simply meaning that his slavery is no longer contingent upon the repayment of a debt. And in that passage, the way that comes about is, at least I'm sure as you know, and probably people listening know, if the master has a female chattel slave that he gives her to him, to the debt slave as a wife, and they have kids together. The wife is the master's chattel slave. It's her slavery is not contingent upon a debt. This is one of the things that I think Paul Copan misses in his book, where he talks about the husband can just wait out the rest of his wife's term. She's not a debt slave. She's a chattel slave. And the children that are born to that union are also chattel slaves. So again, there is no debt to be repaid for the wife and the children. Otherwise, there'd be no dilemma. One of the reasons that we know that is there'd be no dilemma for the husband, right? That's all he would do is he would just first of all, it would well, anyway. So the point is that he has to make the decision. I either, exercise my right to go free in the seventh year, or I, undergo this ritual where my, ear has whatever is done to it, they all press through it. And then he signs up for life. Now his slavery is no longer contingent upon the debt. There is no debt to be repaid. He's just signed up, right? Because again, the rationale here is he served for the 6 years, so his debt is done. Right. So that's the point. So it's no longer debt contingent. He's now signing up to become a chattel slave. So those are some instances of slaves that are chattel. Of course, the famous one that I think everybody knows is the Leviticus 25:44-46 passage. And again, we know that these are chattel slaves because it's not contingent upon a debt. There is no debt that will be paid off and get the release. These are genuine chattel slaves. They're kept for life. There's permanence to it. So,
And they
if
can
that
be
makes sense,
handed down.
that's right. Yeah, they are called this Hebrew term achuzah, which is the word landed property. It's used almost exclusively as landed property. So property that is part of the inheritance of a family, like land, the land that's their inheritance.
So can they ever be set free?
They can be set free. It's just the law doesn't. There's no regulation. There's no stipulation upon the owner to set them free.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so in Leviticus, I think there's this. Well, I think of the whole Bible as horrible, but Be that as it may, there's a horrible thing in the Bible that says, you can beat your slave, and if he survives the night, but he dies the next day, you don't have to pay for it. But if you beat your slave and he dies that night, what difference does it make if your slave dies that night?
So this is one of the places that I think it's useful for us to make sure that we have I don't want to say balanced, but balanced, I guess, is fair. Understanding of the text. So let's so what you're talking about is Exodus 21, 20 to 21. So if we step out of the Hebrew Bible for a second and go back to like the laws of Hammurabi, and we go back to the distrainee, the person that the creditor comes, and let's say the creditor comes and says, all right, let's say I owe you that $1,000. Well, you want me to keep working to repay that money, so you don't want to come take me necessarily, because you want your $1,000 back. So you might want to leave me to keep working, but what you might do is come take my daughter or my son or one of my slaves, right? You would come and do that and say, they're going to come work for me until you pay this money back, right? That is a distrained person, a distrainee. So the law says that if the distrainee, while in the master's house or the creditor's house, dies of natural causes, there is no cause for a claim. I can't come back to you and say, hey, my slave died in your house, or my daughter died in your house, or whatever. As long as it was natural, and as we see from the next law, the next law says, if they die from a beating, then lex talionis kicks in. So if it's a free daughter, for example, the creditor's free daughter is killed. So it's that eye for eye thing. So the rationale behind this is trying to lay an intent. So in the laws of Hammurabi, what they're getting at is, if that master, obviously the master is going to beat the slave, and there's no question about that, because in their minds and in the minds of the judges and the people in the antebellum South, that's how you motivated slaves. That's how you did it. You can't use words to motivate them. Read Proverbs 29, 19 to 21. They're not motivated by words alone. So, this was not abnormal in their eyes, right? They beat kids for the same reason, right? Kids needed to be corrected, and that's what they viewed this as. So, if we then come forward to Exodus 21, in this scenario, the master is beating the male or female slave. That to me, that's the one that's jarring, male or female slave. No distinction there. But again, totally expected. If the master beats them with a wooden rod and they die under their hand, so immediately, the rationale here, I think, is that, and this is like consensus scholarship position. Nothing new to me here. That it's getting at the intent. If the slave died immediately, and this is likely a debt slave, if the slave died immediately under his hand, the idea is, well, he obviously meant to kill him. That's murderous intent, because a correction beating shouldn't kill, because you're hitting the back, or maybe the legs, but nowhere vital like that. You shouldn't be hitting them anywhere vital to kill them. This is just moderate correction to beating them, corporal punishment to correct them. Atrocious to us, right? As well it should be. So then the rationale is if he survives a day or two, then the benefit of the doubt is afforded to the slave owner. Well, maybe he was beating him in the back, and not that he got an infection or something, but not that they would go through that process, but there was some mitigating circumstance. So the benefit of the doubt is given to the master. Well, maybe something else caused his death. It wasn't murderous intent, because if it were murderous intent, he should have died immediately. And that's sort of how it's the same sort of logic, I guess, that we see like in cases of trying to determine if something is rape in Deuteronomy 22. If the man rapes a woman out in the field, that's rape. But if it's in the city, well, I mean, it's not, because she would have cried out. That makes logical sense to them, right? Now, of course, they're not thinking psychologically about, give me a break. Lots
Or
of
unless
people,
the dude has a knife.
right? I mean,
know?
there's a legal rationale behind this that's sort of prevalent to the time. So, but that's what's happening. I think there is trying to get at a way to get at the intent. And the thing is, the same sort of thing applies to the antebellum South. If you look at the laws and the way the judges rationalize about how to set these laws, how to determine or what to do if a master murders a slave rather than gives a moderate correction and they die under that moderate correction, what do you do? The rationale is actually very similar. It's a little scary.
Yeah, it is. That's like, that was what, all the way up until the 1860s. And the rationale did not change for like, what was it, 6,000 years? That's scary.
Yeah, it's I'm glad that we're progressing.
Yeah, but not progressing enough. I mean,
this is true. This is true. But that's why we're here, right?
Yeah, people are still dying because they're gay or they're gender fluid.
Oh my God.
But I'm not getting into that today.
Yeah.
So, is there any other kind of slavery that was around?
There's slavery that's I think you see in Exodus 22, someone can be if they've stolen something, they're taken as a form of punishment and to work off that, what they've stolen. You have war captives, of course, they're chattel slaves. So the two big ones that we see are debt and chattel, but there are other ways that you could come into slavery. But again, it all sort of, most of it kind of goes back to, is this contingent upon a debt or is it not? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that like war captives were pretty, depending on the period, I think we have pretty significant evidence for war captives and debt slaves. Those are two pretty big ones. But if you look at Ecclesiastes 2, the writer boasts about all the house-born slaves that he has and all the purchased slaves that he has, right? And this was a good thing. It meant that he was incredibly wealthy. The house-born slaves are chattel slaves. The purchased ones may be debt slaves. It depends, but they very well may be chattel slaves. So it can be difficult at times. Sometimes the context doesn't give you enough information to determine which one we're talking about, but yeah.
And one thing that I get quite a lot from the Christians is that, oh, this was the nice kind of slavery. Could you like slavery's ever nice?
Yeah.
Can you address that?
Yeah, my response to that is always, okay. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you about what you consider the nice kind of slavery. Let's just talk about what it was, right? Let's talk about what it was. So slaves were not only expected to be beaten with wooden rods, but it was encouraged. And again, as like, this is not debated stuff. You see it clearly in the Proverbs. But of course, there in Exodus 21, it's that's the point. So slaves are beaten for moderate correction to motivate them. Slaves are deprived of the ability to have their freedom. Their freedom is taken away. Foreigners. So this is the thing that I think I often hear people say things like, "Oh, I was like a sports player." Well, it's not like a sports player. Sports players can leave. Now, there might be financial loss if they leave. They might not get their full contract, or there might be penalties or something. I don't know how it works, but the owner doesn't keep them in his house and say, "Oh no, you got 6 more years here, buddy. You can't leave." So slaves are kept. So slavery, debt slavery in particular, was technically or legally volitional, right? So if I signed on the dotted line, proverbially speaking, or actually signed the contract, then I'm agreeing that if I default on this loan, that excuse me, I will become your slave to pay off that debt. However, so in that sense, it was voluntary. However, once that slavery was enacted, and once you sign the contract, you didn't have a way to like back out of it except to pay off the debt. But once you were taken as a slave, it's not voluntary, and you can't like wake up on the 7th day and go, well, this isn't really for me. I'm going to figure out some other way to take care of this, or I'm going to go file for bankruptcy or something. No, that's it. You're in. So
and how volitional is it really if you need that loan?
Sure. It's under like duress is something that is not really, that's not something that's considered. One of the things that I think is actually really faulty about this logic, about it being like the quote unquote nice type of slavery, is failing to make accurate comparisons to what was going on in the ancient Near East. So again, people just sort of take the Bible's word for it, take the narrative's word for it, that all the other, heathen nations that were around them were just these unbelievably wicked people. They're not. They're like normal folk, right? They're very much like the Israelites were. And so if you read through, and I would just, I would suggest, I don't have the book sitting here in front of me, but Martha Roth put together English translations of all of these Mesopotamian law collections. All right. So, the famous laws of Hammurabi, but then the laws of Ornamu, Lipit-Ishtar, Eshnuna, the Middle Assyrian laws, New Assyrian stuff, whatever, the Hittite laws. And just read through them. In particular, read through many of these laws have like a prologue and an epilogue before the actual laws themselves. And just read through it, because what the king is doing is it's a royal propaganda piece. Hammurabi takes some time and talks about in the beginning about how great of a king he is, how just he is, how he cares for the poor, he cares for the orphan, he cares for the needy. Right? The whole point of what he's trying to say there is he is a good shepherd to his people. And this is something that is incredibly important that people just either don't know about or just completely miss, is this idea that the Hebrew Bible is those are the laws that are caring about people. No, all of these law collections that have these, that we can gain insight into the motivation behind them, or what the better to say, what the text is trying to get you to understand or to believe, is that the king is this great guy, and he is really looking out for the welfare of the people. And we see this in reality. It's more for an economic benefit to the king and to the land. But like when kings in the ancient Near East would come to power, they would often declare what's called Andoraru or a Misharam edict. And basically what it was, it's the same thing that you see in the Jubilee. They would just cancel all debts. That's what it would be. It's what the Jubilee is. It cancels debts for people that live in the land. And that's what the king would do. He'd just say, oh, all debts are canceled. Normally it wasn't like over the entire country or anything. Sometimes it was, but the idea was that you started to get this discrepancy in the rich and the poor. And by releasing all the debts and setting everybody back to their own land, it brought it back to, sort of square one, in a lot of ways. And it was to try to protect the poor from becoming poor, right? It's sort of the Robin Hood sort of thing. And this is what we see in the Hebrew Bible with the Jubilee. This is what the Jubilee is trying to do in Leviticus 25. It is trying to just keep everything even keel. So every 50 years, just start over again.
But as far as we know, the Jubilee was never celebrated, correct?
Yeah, right. And I mean, like, even the 7-year Sabbath, even according to the text itself, was never observed. And of course, we see this sort of thing in Jeremiah 34, right? So, I mean, the people, at least according to the narrative, they weren't obeying these laws, or at least the slavery laws. But there's not this huge discrepancy between, the wicked, awful people in the ancient Near East outside of Israel and the Israelites.
No, I mean, there's really not, because we were talking about this before we came on. The Israelites did not come out of from outside of Canaan. They were an indigenous Canaanite movement.
Yeah.
So, and I've got stuff on that if you want to know more about that on my channel. So, but let's get in the New Testament, because, there's a lot of things. A lot of people are like, oh, that's Old Testament. Well, the New Testament has slavery too. So let's talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, of course, while I have training in the New Testament, it's certainly not my, field of expertise. I noticed that I say that a lot. People bring that to my attention, that I say that a lot. But sorry, just feel like that's a responsible thing to say.
No, that's okay. No big deal.
But I will point out, I guess, that the book that I wrote on slavery didn't get into the New Testament material. And in this new book that I'm writing, just so that if people want more details, I guess, about what I'm getting ready to say, I have a chapter. Since it's a handbook, I thought I needed to put a chapter in there about slavery, where I talk about, I do an overview of the Old Testament, legal sections about slavery. But then I have a new section in there, one about the New Testament and some standard apologetic arguments that are used, and then one about the antebellum South. So some new stuff in there, and so people don't feel like they're wasting their money if they pick up that book. But part of the problem with the New Testament, I think, is it's a different situation for the people. So what I mean by that is, when you look through the Old Testament text, the Old Testament is setting itself up, not that it matched historical reality, but it's portraying itself as God setting the laws from a top-down perspective. So God is setting the standard. He's, Israel's supposed to be part of this theocracy, and they're the ones that are going to be in power, and God's saying, this is what I want you to do because you're the people that are in charge. In the New Testament, the roles are reversed, right? So you have texts that are written from the bottom. So people that are not in charge, they're not setting precedent. They're not making the rules. So I think we have to allow for that a little bit. Now, that being said, just trying to be fair. That being said, the argument that I hear all the time, I'm sure you've heard it too, is from Matthew 19. So the Pharisees come to Jesus and say, essentially, Hillel, I mean, they don't say this, but it's like Hillel has this opinion about divorce and Shammai has this other opinion. What do you say about divorce? And it sort of there's a back and forth, and well, wait a minute, why did Moses allow for divorce in the law? And Jesus says, because of the hardness of your hearts, right? Hardness of your hearts. And it wasn't so from the beginning, right? So if you could go back to creation, man and woman together, interestingly enough, Jesus then allows for divorce in a particular circumstance. But nevertheless, that principle of, well, wait a minute, there's something in the law that's not the ideal, but God allows it because people have hard hearts. We can abstract that essentially and then reapply it other places that we see fit. That's the problem with it, is it becomes somewhat arbitrary, right? Very
Right.
arbitrary.
Yeah, very arbitrary. Yeah,
so
like you're saying, kind of like when people talk about the Old Testament to me, I'm like, would you rather be living in the Old Testament times in Israel? Of course, we know most of the Old Testament is not historically accurate at any rate, but at the time when these things were actually written, not when they were purported to be written, but when they were actually written, would you rather be living at that place and at that time, or would you rather be living now?
Yeah. Whether you're following the narrative or following what we know historically, I think either way, most people, I would imagine, would want to be living now. But the real problem that I see with this line of thinking is, and this is sort of what I talk about in the book, is there are certain things that I would expect to see. And I think we almost have to see them, at least to some degree, if we're going to. You can't just arbitrarily apply this principle of hardness of heart, therefore God allowed it, to whatever you want, because then I can do it, right? Well, wait a minute, you can't discipline your kids, right? And because or anyway, without getting this too complicated. So one of the things that I would expect to see in the New Testament is a condemnation of slavery. Right? Then that would work. I mean, at least it would have a better chance of working. So if you start looking for condemnation of slavery, you're sorely disappointed. Now, there are certain passages that people go to try to find that condemnation. And I'll go through, if you want, I can go through a couple of them here. The big one that everybody always goes to is Philemon, right? The book of Philemon. So for anybody that doesn't know, in the book of Philemon, Paul's writing to Philemon and saying, look, under the best interpretive situation for a slavery condemnation scenario, because the book of Philemon's debated about what it's about. But let's say best case scenario for the apologist, Paul is writing to Philemon and saying, hey, that your slave ran away and I'm sending him back to you. Now, look, he owes you this, but I'm asking you to forgive him this. Don't hold it against him. And I leave it up to you, but I trust that you'll use good judgment here and set him free so that he can come back and work, do the Lord's service for me. So that is interpreted as Paul giving sort of this overarching condemnation of slavery, calling for its abolition, or at least like in a subtle way. The problem, of course, with that interpretation outside of the debated aspects of the book of Philemon is that you have to assume then that Paul knows that slavery is bad. It's bad to own people. And doesn't say, hey, dude, bad to own people. you're in Christ, you're a Christian now. You're not supposed to be keeping slaves. What the dizzle, my mizzle, right? I mean, like, set them free. But he doesn't, and can you imagine Paul saying, hey, listen, I don't want you to have extramarital affairs, but I'm going to leave this up to you, right? Use your, I'm going to leave this one up to you. No, I mean, he has no problem calling out people for what he believes to be their sin.
Exactly. And then it's either First Timothy or Second Timothy. And I know one of the Timothys is debated as to whether it was written by Paul or not. Can't remember which one it is. But either First or Second Timothy says, slaves, obey your masters. So that is a clear endorsement.
Yeah. And so that it's sort of in that vein. The next verse that I hear quite a bit is from First Timothy 1:10, where Paul is giving a list of vices, and he says slave traders. Right? Well, whoa, hey, that's that's Paul condemning the slave trade. Slave traders, they're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. Well, that's not saying what they think it's saying. So slave trading, I kind of like to say it like this, and I said this to Cliff and Stuart Connectly in that debate that I did on Modern Day Debate with Matt Dillahunty. It's illegal to steal cars. It doesn't mean that it's illegal to own cars, right? And that's essentially what that verse is doing. Slave trading was stealing people illegally, or stealing people, which was illegal. Right. And it wasn't just illegal in the New Testament. The New Testament, like First Timothy 1:10, isn't like, oh my gosh, this is new and groundbreaking. This is directly from a vice list from the periods. I think several vice lists. So like it's not saying what they think it's saying. It's saying it's illegal to engage in the illegal slave trade, right? Which is, stealing free people and reducing them to slavery. You can't do that. And you couldn't do it in Rome. But there was still slavery in Rome. So, I mean, anyway.
Yeah, I find that a lot of things don't say what they say. And I don't know. I really don't know whether they're just taught that and they don't really think it through.
Yeah.
Or whether they're just lying. Now my position on it is the upper tier, the pastors, especially like the mega pastors, they know it's a bunch of bullshit. And it could be, it could not be, but that's my position on it. The other people, maybe not so much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough to know.
But
I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say the problem, I think, besides these individual passages that are supposed to condemn slavery, that don't really condemn slavery, the opposite is actually the case, right? Not necessarily that Jesus, for example, is purported to have come out and said slavery is great, woohoo. But implicitly, this is the case. So in so many of his parables are predicated on the normal state of slavery. For example, in Luke 17 is one of the passages that I cite in the book. Jesus looks at his disciples and says, which one of you having a slave, so I mean, which one of you having a slave, and then goes on to talk about what they would do in that scenario. So which one of you having a slave that worked in the field all day? So this is a slave private slave, worked for them in the house at a very local level, which one of you would have your slave working in the field all day, and when he comes back in, say to him, hey, sit down and eat with me? No, of course, the point. No, of course you wouldn't say that. Rather, you would say, go into the kitchen, make my dinner, right? You've worked all day, but go into the kitchen, make my dinner, bring it out to me, and then stand here and wait on me while I eat it. And then only after all of that.
Baby.
Huh? Sorry.
And then you can have your dinner, maybe.
Exactly. And that the purpose of the parable, right, was to say, look, you, my disciples, are just like those worthless slaves. And it doesn't mean that it means that that's their job and they don't get anything special for doing their job. And that's the point. So, Jesus says, even after you have done all of these things, you're still worthless slaves. In other words, you haven't done anything more than what you were supposed to do. So, the point of passages like that, and there are two books on this that I can recommend. Jennifer Glancy has written rather prolifically for probably more than 20 years on this. So Glancy, Glancy, and Slavery in Early Christianity, I think, is the title of her book. But more recently, Ronald Charles has written a book, Silencing of the Slave Bodies, I think is what it's called, or Silencing of the Slaves in the New Testament, something like that. It's a Routledge book. But they're looking at the New Testament in particular and saying, what is it that the New Testament is doing with slavery? And it's not good, right? So in other words, not only do these passages that are supposed to condemn slavery in the New Testament not condemn slavery, but so much of the writing, be it the metaphors that are used or the parables that are told, the lessons that are learned, they're all predicated on the normalcy of slavery. So it's not only is there not a condemnation of it, it's an embraced way of life. So and sort of the nail in the coffin for me, and then I'll be quiet, but sort of the nail in the coffin for me about, whether the New Testament openly condemned slavery was that the early church, if the New Testament came out of Jesus or, the Gospels or Paul or if they condemned slavery, the early church missed it completely, because they had slaves. And I give some examples of that from Jennifer Glancy's book. But like Chrysostom, the times that people there were a couple that had problems with slavery, but generally it wasn't because there was some moral problem with owning people. It was like, I think it was Chrysostom that said essentially, look, if you have more than one slave or more than two slaves, you're being really gluttonous. And gluttony is not a good thing. So,
right. Yeah. No,
I,
no, we don't have any problem with you owning people. We have a problem with you being, selfish and having too many slaves.
yeah. So I think that you're not going to see condemnation of the New Testament of slavery in the New Testament. I don't think.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely going to have you on again so we can talk about what we were talking about before we came on, because I eat this stuff up. And but anyway, I'll let you go.
No, it's okay. I mean, if I saw if you want, but we definitely don't have to. If you need to end, we definitely can. I did see that some people had some questions in the side chat. If you wanted me to address them.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll have to scroll back up and find them unless you can see them.
Marianne asked if you studied religion just because you found it interesting, but I told her you used to be religious.
Yeah, so I was an evangelical fundamentalist Christian for 25, 26 years. I was raised, an evangelical. I pastored a church for 7 years. I was a chaplain in the Air Force. And then I went to Johns Hopkins and started studying Assyriology, and it became problematic for me. So I became an atheist. Then I kind of went into agnosticism, and I would say now I'm an agnostic atheist. I think is how I'd probably define myself. But yeah, it's not because it is. I do definitely find it interesting. There's no question about it. But yeah, it's a good question. There were others.
Yeah, let me go up here and see.
I caught them as they came up, but here's one by the Fifth Trumpet.
Okay.
Off topic. Why is Genesis 1 mostly all of the first sentence of the new paragraph start with the word and?
Well, actually, Dr. Josh speaks ancient Hebrew and Aramaic, so that's a Dr. Josh question.
I'm trying to understand it. Why is Genesis 1 mostly all of the first sentences of the new paragraphs start with the word and? So Hebrew has there's a narrative style it's called there's a narrative connection, and it uses evolved, consecutive, and perfect. That's the technical term for it. The Hebrew is vayehi, so and it came to pass or and it happened. It's how they connect. It's how they keep the narrative going. So like, and there was evening and there was morning is vayehi erev, vayehi voker, so vayehi here the vayehi. And it's not just the word and it came to pass. There's that the other verbs can be placed in that string, but that's just sort of how they do it. It's sort of like a wooden and then and then and then and then. It's I'm making it sound less literarily beautiful than it is, but it if that's the question.
I'm pretty sure that was the question, and just I think we've answered all the questions. Just to fill in. Go ahead.
There's one by someone named Otangelo G.
Yeah, Otangelo Grasso. He's a pretty cool Christian. He's an evangelical.
So if you are concerned with slavery, have you ever done something to fight slavery today? There are plenty of sex slaves today in the United States. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's asked in a very poor spirit, but nonetheless, I think it's a good question. And I think the answer is one, God, I want to do more. But I actually think that what I'm doing right here is a step in that direction. And I'll tell you why. What I think people miss about slavery in the antebellum South, and I sort of mentioned this earlier in the stream, is that the legal rationale that the judges utilized in making their decisions about what masters could do to their slaves, what they couldn't do to their slaves, followed the same, in many cases, legal rationale that we see in the Hebrew Bible. And that's scary to me because, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And what I often hear apologists doing here online is utilizing these same justifications and the same rationale. So I think it's actually very important for us to recognize, even in these forums here, that there is no justification for slavery, and it's what I find myself fighting more than I would have imagined that I would. So I don't think his question was a genuine question. I think it was a antagonistic question.
Yeah, me too. And he's saying something about demonstrating superior morals, do something like paying to free a sex slave. Otangelo, that's not how it works. That's not how it works, buddy. You got to rescue sex slaves. And part of the problem is we don't even know how big the problem is.
And I mean, Yeah, I think the issue here, that seems like unfortunately, it sounds like quite a bit of a dodge to the real problem that we're
Right.
addressing here. And that is the defense of the morality of the Old Testament when it shouldn't be defended. It shouldn't
Right.
be defended. So, if if I write a chapter or I come and do a stream, or I present to you, for example, Jay Caballero's work on sex crimes in the Hebrew Bible, and we talk about things like Deuteronomy, 21, with the captive wife that is taken against her will, and raped, because that's what it is, right? From how we define rape in the 21st century, that's exactly what it is. It's non-consensual sex. If the response to that is at first to try to defend the Hebrew Bible and say, no, it's not really rape, you're misunderstanding it, and failing that, to then say, well, how do you fight rape? That's sort of sidestepping the issue. I agree 100% that slavery is abhorrent. Unfortunately, I'm not sure in all circumstances that the people that I debate do agree that slavery in all circumstances is abhorrent. And I agree that we should be doing all that we can to end slavery. But that doesn't in any way lessen the fact that the Hebrew Bible endorses slavery, period.
Exactly.
And we should recognize that and move forward with that understanding.
Right.
So,
well, thank you very much for being on here, Dr. Josh. I've enjoyed it immensely. And I will have you
having me. Sounds good.
We'll talk about what we talked about earlier, because like I said, I dig this stuff. Now, are you familiar with Israel archaeology at all, with Beaver's works and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not my field of expertise. I have a chapter in this new book on archaeology and biblical archaeology.
Yeah, but you do Assyria, correct?
Yeah, I mean, so the place that I excavated was in Syria, at a site called Al Mara. But like archaeology is, there's sort of a standard methodology, a modern standard methodology that is used. I've never excavated in Palestine. I've excavated in Syria. So like certainly, if you wanted to get an expert in archaeology, in biblical archaeology, or in archaeology, in general, I'm not your guy, but like you'd want to get William Deaver or Israel Finkelstein, or some of these people. But I can tell you what they say and the evidence that they're utilizing.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you for coming on.
Of course. You want me to just drop out, or?
Yeah, you can go ahead and drop out.
Okay. All right. Take care. Thanks, Lisa.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Okay, guys. That is it for today. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Dr. Josh, and I will have him on again. He's one of my favorites, one of my favorite YouTubers. So, at any rate, you have a wonderful, wonderful day, and I'll see you later. Bye.